this has been a thing for universities to do recently. I would love to see something like, I don't know, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, for example, adopt something like that. How are you going to enforce it? And the other thing is that, is there enough bias in the people who would be enforcing it that neutral falls onto their own side of the political spectrum? Alrighty. Going off the theme from a couple of weeks ago, and I apologize for last week. Last week was a combination of insanely busy and technical difficulties at the same time. So hopefully I have figured out the technical difficulties and we'll be back in order appropriately. But 2 weeks ago I talked about nature, and the study in Nature Human Behavior, which basically showed that nature shot themselves in the foot by making a political endorsement of then candidate Joe Biden for president in 2020. People didn't like it. And then nature decided, oh, no, we're going to double down and do it again. To which the author of the study even responded at that being a fairly bad reasoning for what they do. Go back to that video if you'd like to see that. But this came across my radar from the Heterodox Academy blog. And I wanted to continue in that vein of topic because the debate amongst scientists as to whether or not they should get involved in political advocacy has been raging for a very, very long time. I remember talking about this with folks at least 10 years ago, if not longer ago than that. So, at least that long, and probably much longer, has this particularly been raging. But this is a very well thought piece, and I think it would actually be an interesting one to go through here, just to get a sense of some of the arguments here from the Heterodox Academy blog. And I will say this is relatively short, so I may read and comment on the whole thing. Partisan science is bad for science and society. It has become common in the last decade for top scientific journals and scientific institutions to become involved in political advocacy. Matt Burgess and Roger Pielke Jr. explain that when science becomes partisan, public trust in science decreases. Scientific institutions would improve their scholarship and public trust by rejecting reflexive partisanship. Okay. Over the past 10 years, scientific institutions, including universities, public funding agencies, and major journals, have become much more actively involved in political advocacy, usually on behalf of left-leaning candidates or causes. The timing roughly corresponds with the leftward shift in elite discourse in the mid-2010s, sometimes called the Great Awakening. See the figure below for examples, here and here for more. Now, of course, tending toward political advocacy in universities, funding agencies, and journals to begin with is a bad thing, regardless of which way, because you're going to have a tendency and a bias to stifle opposing opinions, as it will. And that's not helpful for science. We need very different perspectives and approaches to get at the truth, which is the fundamental purpose of science to begin with. But why usually on behalf of left-leaning candidates or causes? Burgess and Pielke don't go into that with this in terms of why it's left-leaning. And I haven't seen a study of why that might be the case. One could make the intuitive leap, though, that this is because significant numbers of the faculty at universities and then on into the funding agencies, and it's a lot of the faculty at universities who are also editors of journals, are also significant numbers of significantly left-leaning themselves. That is a possibility, but again, we don't know exactly. There's not necessarily correlation there, but that might be the leap taken. For instance, it has become common for Science and Nature to publish editorials taking political positions on contested issues. These links, as I checked them before, actually go to the articles I had covered previously with respect to Science and Nature, where they, quite frankly, don't seem to get what the purpose of science is, and what the role of scientists are as opposed to what the role of the Supreme Court is. The Nature family has introduced editorial guidelines explicitly opening the door. Try that again. The Nature family has explicitly introduced editorial guidelines that explicitly open the door to give advocacy groups veto power over research findings. Which one is this? Because I can't remember. Oh, yes, that one. Covered that one a while back, too. Yep. Bad idea. U.S. universities increasingly require diversity, equity, inclusion statements or criteria for faculty, hiring, grant proposals, promotion, and merit reviews, which are often evaluated as progressive political litmus tests. I agree with that sentiment. You guys already know that if you've been watching this channel long enough. The number of politically motivated deplatforming or firing incidents, most of which come from the left, has increased, and these are sometimes supported by administrators, as we recently saw at Stanford. Now, if you've been under a rock, I can recap the Stanford thing really quickly. The Federalist Society at the Stanford Law School invited a judge, Judge Kyle Duncan, to speak on campus. There was a raucous protest that basically resulted in a heckler's veto, and in participating in the heckler's veto was one of the deans of the law school. Not doing a great job teaching about the law, but anyway. The fractions of professors who are afraid to speak their minds and who have been threatened or punished for their speech is large and skews moderate and conservative. Yeah, I know which report that is. The fraction of professors who are conservative is small and decreasing. These examples represent the tip of a larger iceberg. The pushing for science institutions to become more explicitly partisan usually makes some version of the following two arguments. 1. Scientists have a trusted and respected position in society. We should capitalize on that authority to advance our shared progressive political views and preferred policies. See here and here. I'm going to look at those myself because I'm curious about that. Fact matter, let me pull them open real quick. Oh, goodness, yeah. Yeah. Oh, nature. I'm not surprised. Scientists are not perfectly objective, and science has always been influenced by politics. Therefore, we should be intentional about politicizing science in ways that advance important political positions. See here and here. Both arguments are flawed. Now, here's the thing. The first argument also has one false presupposition to it, or false assumption to it, that everyone shares the same preference for political views and policies, presuming that scientists are a monolith with how they think, except with respect to the different scientific approaches they take. This is fundamentally flawed just on that assertion. Sheesh. The first argument naively takes the scientist's trusted position in society for granted, rather than recognizing that trust is something we hold conditionally and can lose. We hold it conditionally on providing the services of making discoveries about the world, turning knowledge and know-how into useful technologies and other applications, educating the next generation of students and scholars, and participating in the public square as advocates, arbiters, or honest brokers. We can place our trusted position in society at risk when we subordinate these roles to engage in partisan politics or stealth advocacy by advocating our interests while pretending to be above the fray as scientists. Now, I want to make a point here because I very much agree with that I think a lot of scientists have very naively taken it for granted that most folks, even today, as crazy as it is, you can find, Pew polls and what have you, that not the vast majority, but a majority of Americans still trust scientists, trust many different types of scientists, and still trust doctors and things like that. And this presents a certain amount of power to a person tempted by it. I've talked about this a little bit, in that if you are very well trusted, as scientists are for most of the public, that does offer the temptation to say, we should do it this way because X, X, and X. And have that be taken somewhat as gospel. In other words, it feeds the sort of narrative of scientism. Scientism being the irrational belief that science can solve all ills, which, again, it's not science's purpose to necessarily solve all ills and answer even all the moral questions. Here it is not. In fact, it's science's job to necessarily answer all the moral questions. For example, what's the role of the Supreme Court versus the role of the scientist? They're not the same thing. And yet, you're trying to say the court is anti-science when it also has to take into account many other things that are not just based upon scientific related things. They also have to account for, like, whether or not some position or something that the government has done is within its authority under the U.S. Constitution. That is a very different role from the role of a scientist. And yet, don't go there. So, I mean, that's what I get at with this, is that don't take it for granted, if you are a scientist, that you do, generally speaking, have a lot of trust with most of society. Because it can come back to bite you. Scientists are already losing public trust along partisan lines. See the graphic below. And it's definitely in here. Hopefully I can blow this up a little bit. A recent study in Nature Human Behavior underscores this point. Its author found that U.S. voters who read Nature's endorsement of Joe Biden in 2020 did not change their opinion of him, being Joe Biden, but were less likely to trust scientists and Nature, and less likely to pay attention to Nature's findings on COVID-19. A subsequent Nature editorial defended the endorsement decision despite its consequences. Now, I've already talked about this. When I went into the study and read it a little bit, I disagreed somewhat with the conclusion that less likely to trust scientists. Yes, it's there that, yes, there's statistical significance to it, but when you look at the actual graphic numbers with it and the bar charts next to each other, practically I wonder what the difference of a percent or two is in a column, whereas the being less trusting of Nature was gigantic. So that suggests there's a little bit more discernment and recognition that no, scientists think the same or agree with Nature. And Nature certainly doesn't speak for all scientists. Anyway. Panel A compares trends in campus disinvitations for the left, scholars under fire, i.e. targeted forum for discipline from the left, and frequency of equity in funded NSF grant abstracts to top. Trends in trust in universities and the scientific community, bottom panel. Panel B shows the percentage of U.S. professors' political donations going to Republicans and the share of right-leaning academics perceiving hostile claims and have been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their beliefs, all from reported in 2020. That's a strange freaking typo. So yeah, equity in NSF abstracts, scholars under fire from the left, disinvitations. That's kind of been really steady, but under fire for sure. Confidence in the scientific community under Republicans, confidence in the scientific community under Democrats. Universities have a positive effect on the country, way down. I think I might have covered that at one point. And that's the Democrat one, which is sort of flatlined. U.S. professors' donations going to Republicans, right-leaning U.S. academics reporting hostile climate for their beliefs. This is 70-ish%. Right-leaning academics disciplined or threatened with discipline for their beliefs. So, some interesting things here. And of course, there are links in here. To put it bluntly, if scientific institutions continue to openly and preferentially support the progressive wing of the Democratic Party's preferred positions and causes, then we shouldn't be surprised if public support for the scientific community eventually approximates its support for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, a level of support often insufficient to win elections in progressive strongholds like New York City, Minneapolis, Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle. If scientific institutions come to be viewed as campaigning NGOs, then we should not be surprised to see more calls to defund universities, abolish left activist disciplines, weaken or eliminate tenure, and build new competitor universities. That is not a desirable future for most of us in the academy. To a general degree, I agree with the sentiment that most of those things are not desirable. That said, there are probably some things that do need to get shaken up in universities, particularly with protecting diverse viewpoints, and particularly in reestablishing a culture that is about truth seeking in a university, or rather making sure that culture is maintained and expanded. So that would be my more concern with that. I'm not going to get into those just yet. I may another time, but not today. Flaws in the argument that science has always been political, so we should embrace the ideological posture, are subtler, but also more pernicious. It's true that science and politics are almost always intermixed. This is a true statement, for sure, because what are we talking about with this? You have National Science Foundation, you have many different agencies that have their own calls for proposals, and they put out grant funding and what have you. And ostensibly, you do have some influence from which political administration is in power on what things they want to research and what money goes to which agency and which research division and things like that. When the budget goes on this, when the budget discussions goes on, this is one of the big things that there's arguments over in Congress, between Congress and the White House, and the like. It never fails. To that degree, yes. There's not Burgess and Pilkey are not wrong about that. But we have yet to find a better way to access reliable knowledge than the scientific method, subject to open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and rigorous exchange of competing ideas. We bet our lives on the scientific method every day when we drive across a bridge, get on an airplane, or go to the doctor. We experts have options in how we engage with policy and politics, but subsuming scientific integrity to partisan politicization will only make it harder to bring evidence to light, and that helps society solve important problems, including, perhaps especially, those problems that are progressive priorities. So, yes. So there's one thing. You may have a funding institution that's a political institution or an advocate institution. You may also very much have your own political beliefs. That is not to say that you should embrace them in how you do research. In here, that's probably not a good thing at all. In here, and oftentimes it also makes it harder to bring some evidence to light that probably needs to get seen. If it's true, if you find something and it goes against something that, partisan funder or what have you, if it goes down to ideological partisanship, whether be it from the right or the left, and you can't show it because of that, well, that's probably a detriment. For example, several top public health experts warned in October 2020 that the potential costs of long-term lockdowns, including to education, might outweigh the benefits, compared to a more targeted approach protecting the most vulnerable. Some of these experts were harassed by their colleagues and censored by tech companies at the urging of top public health officials. The universities did little to defend their academic freedom. Subsequent research suggests that long-term closures had devastating effects on learning, especially among disadvantaged students, and jurisdictions such as Sweden and Florida that followed the advice of reopening schools earlier did not suffer greater overall pandemic mortality, but had much better educational outcomes. After the horrific murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 in Minneapolis, the scientific community rallied around causes of ending systemic racism and speaking out against police brutality targeting Black Americans. Medical researchers urged participation in mass protests despite the pandemic. A major journal retracted a study showing nuances in patterns of racial bias in policing over concerns about how the study was being reported on in the public discourse. An editor of a major economics journal was nearly removed for publicly criticizing the protests. Yet, as the defund the police movement gained steam, there was not a concerted effort by the scientific community to present and discuss the already clear evidence suggesting that a reduction in police forces and police budgets posed significant public safety risks, especially to disadvantaged communities, and went against the wishes of the overwhelming majority of Black Americans. The demonization, attrition, and in some places defunding of police is now widely seen as one of the most important causes of the ongoing crime surge in the U.S., which has caused roughly 6,000 additional murders per year compared to 2019. Not to mention the flight of businesses, capital, and people, again disproportionately affecting disadvantaged communities. So this is the point when you let what he's providing here is examples of what can go wrong when you let politicization just run amok and decide what can be researched, for one thing, and what can be talked about with respect to research. Restricting both of those things is somewhat bad. Doesn't help us when we're getting at the truth. And you need that back and forth exchange. You need that diverse set of worldviews and perspectives to help you get at the truth. In 2015, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff warned that college campuses were increasingly promoting, in the name of inclusion, habits of mind that were conducive to anxiety and depression. In a 2018 book expanding on their argument, they summarized these ideas as the 3 great untruths. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker, catastrophizing. Always trust your feelings, emotional reasoning. And life is a battle between good and evil people, dichotomous thinking. Or false dichotomous thinking, for that matter. Musa Al-Gharbi recently detailed in American Affairs the mounting evidence that Haidt and Lukianoff were right to be concerned, and that these ideas have probably been a major driver of the youth mental health crisis, which disproportionately affects politically liberal women and girls. Alarmingly, Al-Gharbi cites a survey finding more than half of liberal women between ages of 18 and 29 report having been diagnosed with a mental health condition. That's scary. There are many other examples of pathologically politicized scientific discourse leading to possibly harmful policies and practices, along with limited opportunities for open discussion and debate, including laissez-faire approaches to hard drug use, possibly exacerbating deaths of despair, homelessness, and lawlessness in some major cities, abandoning phonics, explicit instruction, and tracking in education, possibly harming reading and math preparedness, and overuse of implausible catastrophic climate change scenarios, likely contributing to paralyzing doomism and climate anxiety among youth, as we've written about before, to name a few. Now, that last one in particular I've talked about before. I talked about it with Deb Philman from The Reason We Learn some time back. Like, there was a Lancet study that came out that talked about 60%, I think it was, of youth have climate anxiety, or eco-anxiety, if you will. That kind of alarmistic rhetoric doesn't help mental health. Of course, there are also those, mostly outside the academy, who regularly attempt to politicize and undermine science for conservative ideological reasons. I would say that happens from both conservative and liberal, but anyway. This happens often in our fields of climate change and environmental studies, too. Being smarter about science and policy and politics is not about choosing which partisan side to support. The pathological politicization of science is a problem regardless of the political agenda being advanced. Yes, this would be a problem either way, and I would be just as annoyed if it were from the right as much as it is from the left. What can we do to change course? Scientific institutions can start by adopting the University of Chicago's Calvin Report on the university's role in political and social action, or a similar policy which states that the university as an institution must remain neutral on political and social matters to allow for wide-ranging and vigorous debates and positions by faculty and students. Quote, the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic, the Calvin Report notes. Now, all well and good, and by all means, do it. This has been a thing for universities to do recently. I would love to see something like, I don't know, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, for example, adopt something like that. How are you going to enforce it? And the other thing is that, is there enough bias in the people who would be enforcing it that neutral falls onto their own side of the political spectrum with respect to issues? Those are the kinds of questions I would be asking about that. Stanford Law School's Dean Jenny Martinez recently made a similar commitment in response to the deplatforming at her school. So this actually has to do with the judge, Judge Duncan, who had to deal with a heckler's veto. Quote, our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion is not going to take the form of having the school administration announce institutional positions on a wide range of current social and political issues, make frequent institutional statements about current news events, or exclude or condemn speakers who hold views on social and political issues with whom Some or even many in our community disagree. That's nice. How are you going to enforce it? Politicians, regulators, and accreditors concerned about the scientific integrity and public trust might consider making such a commitment a precondition for funding and accreditation. Um, I mean that might be so. That might be so the way to do that. Fact of the matter, that might be a really interesting way to do it. Could do it with, bit of legislation or a bit of regulation. Well, preferably legislation, right? To say to an agency, you shall not fund unless they have commitment to. Then again, I wonder if that would run afoul of a free speech argumentation. So that would be for a lawyer to answer. I do not know. Scientists, whether as individuals or parts of organizations, have a wide range of choices in how they choose to engage in policy and politics. One of us, Pielke Jr., details in the book The Honest Broker. Scientists can be pure scientists who stay out of politics and policy entirely, science arbiters who translate scientific findings for policy and political audiences, typically through advisory bodies, issue advocates who advocate for specific issues or policies but do so transparently and openly, or honest brokers of policy alternatives who present a range of policy options and their expected outcomes. All roles are important in society, and what matters most is that the expert community reflects on its possible roles and responsibilities as part of furthering democratic practices. But don't forget the first and foremost job of a scientist is the pursuit of the truth. In here, regardless of where they end up in that sort of communications spectrum with respect to policy and political audiences. See, there's a lot of good possibilities in there, but of course they're not mentioning one option that tends to happen with folks that, that can also inadvertently happen anyway, is you end up advocating and presenting yourself as, which I think with that issue advocate one is a particularly good one to note. I actually don't necessarily have a problem with a scientist who wants to advocate for specific issues and policies, so long as they do it pretty transparently and openly. Because, at least you're being honest with me, right? You're being honest with me about what you think. I'm preferential to that honest brokers kind of approach, where, give me a range and what's the expected outcome, right? That falls into the research and translation thing. But if you wanted to be an issue advocate, I don't necessarily have a problem with that if you're honest with me about it. And you're not hiding behind the mantle of, I'm a scientist, you should listen to me, and I'm going to advocate this policy. So, both institutions and individual scientists don't hide behind the mantle. Yes, don't hide behind the mantle and stealth advocate for your policies. Be honest about it if you're going to do that. That part, it doesn't necessarily bother me. I may vehemently disagree with you, but it doesn't actually bother me all that much if you're going to be honest about it. Both institutions and individual scientists would improve their scholarship and public trust by committing themselves to open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement, while at the same time rejecting reflexive partisanship by leading scientific organizations. Science supports all of society and all of its political and social diversity. Okay. Yes, because in its pursuit of the truth, it is made available then to society, and it leads to some hopefully good discussions, at least on the policy implications. But of course, it's not the only thing to influence policy. Anyway, let me know what you think. I think y'all know where I'm at with this. That I myself, I advocate for the fact that we need to have pursuit of the truth be the most important thing in science, necessarily not zealotry and political activism. So, if it's policies that support that with respect to science, I'm all for it. But that's where it gets interesting. So I don't think I tend to fall less on the spectrum of you should be advocating if you're a scientist for specific policies. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. That I think tends to wreck credibility a bit, but I don't know that there's a study on that off the top of my head. So let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everyone.